I'd like to introduce our next speaker. I have gotten to talk to Caroline many times over the last month and become very fond of her. I'm really excited about hearing about what she's doing because I feel like we need lots of ways to interact online because we may be here for a while. And I think, she is very thoughtful about collaboration and education. And I'm really forward to hearing your thoughts, Caroline. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Angela. I'm just going to share my screen here. There we go. So I'm going to be talking to you today about brainswarming. It isn't my term that I've invented. It was actually published on Harvard Business Reviews by Tony McCaffrey, and I'll be introducing this. But we really started to explore how we can leverage all the different perspectives of these collaborative teams as they come together to problem solve and learn. Trying to get to the next slide. Are you driving the slide here? Ready? I can't seem to be able to advance the slides. Let me try this again. Yes, I'll switch to PowerPoint. Sorry about this. Screen. Can't seem to get to the okay, I'll share this entire screen. PowerPoint up. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. So I'd like to acknowledge this is a group effort. Scott Woodman and Mark Wozni led our first two brainstorms, and it has been the entire D3CODE team that has been participating, as well as many participants from across the institution at our brainstorm events. We've had events where we've had 40 plus people contribute to our brainstorms. So we'll walk through some of this. So as Angela was saying, that amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, we really need to find creative ways of collaborating across different environments, especially with the work from home environment. And this is a real challenge. And with D3CODE, we really start to bring together individuals from varying backgrounds from across the institution. So how do we best leverage that range of perspectives from across the team? So we start to think creatively. When we think of problem solving and coming together as a group, brainstorming, which was actually established back in 1953, was brought together to think about how a team can come together to share ideas. And the main concept of brainstorming was to withhold any judgment. And so you can see in the figure down below on the right that you see a bunch of people coming together with their own ideas, being grouped together into a big cloud of ideas. And that's sort of the concept and the intention of brainstorming. If you see the figure up on the left, you can see what many of us may feel like we experience during brainstorming, where there's one person who's moderating, and there might be the dominant person, like this gentleman in orange who's now chosen to stand up in front of the room and give a monologue, and someone who's basically decided his opinions have not been heard for the last 15 minutes, so he's now checking emails, and this other lady who sort of feels left out. And so brainstorming has good intentions, but may or may not work in the overall dynamics within a group. And within the COVID environment, it becomes even more difficult as we bring people together because we're no longer standing in or sitting in the same room. And in fact, when we actually look back, Tony McCaffrey pointed out that there has been no evidence to show that brainstorming actually produces better results than people working alone. rather than coming together, despite our conceptions that this is the case. And so he came up with this term called brainswarming. It was actually motivated by the observation, and the reason why it's called swarming is this observation that insects can communicate by leaving signals. They leave chemical signals to each other in their environment, and it influences the behavior of others. You can see ants kind of migrating to areas where there's food, and they've left signals along the way. And so the thought was, can a team actually problem solve in a graph form? And I'm sure many of the data scientists here will be excited about this, is that can we actually generate this graph sort of communication where participants leave their ideas, their cognitive signals, which is what I'm calling them, versus the chemical signals that insects leave, in a structured way, so having some framework so that others can build upon them. And the main concept of brainswarming at the initial inception in 2014 is that people work silently and in parallel. So they would work with Post-it notes, and so obviously we couldn't do Post-it notes in the COVID environment, but they work with Post-it notes, putting up their ideas silently in parallel, looking at other people's notes that might trigger them to put additional notes, and they would do that over a short period of time. And so the idea, and they've actually done measurements here where they've compared up to 115 ideas coming out of 15 minutes of brainswarming versus 100 ideas in an hour of brainstorming, and the diversity of the ideas increased. So this is just walking you through brainswarming. So the idea is that you have a goal statement. It tends to be a verb, what you actually want to do. So for instance, this is an example from Tony McCaffrey around removing ice from power lines versus the resources that it takes to actually solve this problem. And these tend to be nouns, objects, people, whether or other resources that you might have, like extra wire. So these are things that we can actually use. And the idea is that we start to come up with ways to connect the resources upwards and the goal statement downwards, and find innovative ways to make these meet in the middle. And the reason why this is important is because some people have their brains work in such a way that when they're given a problem and a goal statement, you'll work your way downwards and naturally come down to the resources. And other people are very much bottom-up people, and so they start from the bottom and they work their way up. And so this actually helps leverage people who think in different ways. And eventually, so you can think, the people who are the big thinkers would say, well, I'm going to remove ice from the power lines. I could either shake the ice off, I could prevent the ice from forming altogether, or I could melt the ice. And so those are big category solutions. Whereas some people could say, well, I have a sonic gun, or I have a helicopter, and so this is how I'm going to make a strong wind to shake the lines. And so you start to connect the dots from the top to the bottom until you have come up with not just one solution or a few solutions, but multiple solutions that can be graphed together. So you come up with a whole host of solutions, and you may then prioritize those as a group to see which is the most feasible and likely to be pursued. So the comparison between brainstorming versus brainswarming is that the brainstorming, you need a facilitator and a scribe, whereas brainswarming in the traditional sense has mostly been done in silence, and people can do it offline. You don't necessarily all have to do it all at the same time. And this works more so in the COVID work from home environment. The difficulty to get people at the right meeting at the right time, having that full attendance in brainswarming versus not being so dependent on scheduling, makes it easier. And the time limitations, this linear process, is the difference between the efficiency of brainswarming versus brainstorming, and the fact that the goals can be malleable in brainswarming. So they're not necessarily fixed goals that we're trying to achieve. And so we took this concept and we made it our own at MD Anderson. We were working through data that was coming into the D3CODE project, and we took on a data-specific goal. So we wanted to track the provenance of blood pressure. And when we started out with this, I would say that I had no idea where this was going. I didn't realize this was going to go where it did go. And so what we did was we started with the 5 W's around how we're going to, around data. So who, what, where, when, and how. So we gave categories. And we also had a very broad audience of participants who came to this brainstorm. So we had people who were from data, the data group, the data stewards, data scientists, as well as people who were from the IT groups, as well as people who were clinical. And so we had to get everyone oriented. And so we gave the resources of software, the sources of data. So what are there databases out there? Are there EMRs out there? There are the data stewards and the people that are involved, as well as the processes. So as we started to connect these dots, we actually came to this group and we started to learn from each other pieces of the environment that we didn't really realize that existed necessarily. So our process was unique because we had this multidisciplinary team with a wide range of backgrounds, and we actually did it over multiple sessions so that people could take time to absorb some of this. And we did offlining where we actually added boxes, and you'll see the next slide how that came together. And we had subsequent sessions where we actually had connect the dots. And so the orientation and orientation and education were done verbally in an active meeting. Whereas we also had the silent in parallel activity occur offline. And we did this all on a platform we did it through Teams. It could be any platform. And we did try to search for other tools that we could have utilized, but we ended up using PowerPoint only because it was something everyone was familiar in doing. And so we used it. It is certainly clunky. And so if there are people out there who have suggestions of better tools we could do to mimic this activity as I show it to you, I would love to hear about them. And we really found that the resources were a discovery effort, and that's why we started with the categories. And so let's just walk this through. So when we went through with who, we came up with, well, the patient could take the blood pressure, or there could be the clinical team, and there are different members of the clinical team. They're the advanced practitioners, the nurse, or the physician in the clinic. In terms of software and sources of data, we found the IT team came to the rescue and gave us a whole host of sources. I learned about some of these sources throughout this process, and we continue to learn. In terms of what we're capturing, the systolic and diastolic blood pressure are the obvious ones, but we also came up with it within discussion that we needed to capture the clinical context so that we could actually interpret the systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And so what does that mean? Well, if the patient is sitting, standing, what were they doing just beforehand? So what was that activity? Were they just, running to the clinic, or had they just had 3 cups of coffee? What was the position of their legs? Because if you cross your legs or uncross your legs, your blood pressure can be different. How much time did they spend resting in that position before the blood pressure was taken? And all of this context will actually influence how we interpret the systolic and diastolic blood pressure. The second piece was we actually moved one of the categories of when down here, because that was that clinical context of day, time of day, how frequent are we doing these, and are we averaging these values? In terms of where, there were different ways to interpret where. There was the clinical context where, inpatient, outpatient, at a drugstore, as well as where did the blood pressure get taken? Was it in the arm, the wrist, the leg, and the laterality was the right or left arm? And so then, as well as how. So if it was a machine, what kind of machine was it? Was it a manual machine? Was it a digital machine? What was the model? What was the calibration of that device relative to the what we consider gold standard within the hospital? So can we calibrate them across in terms of what patients are getting, what readings are being taken at home versus what readings are being taken in the hospital? And we continued on through this process through the different data stewards, the different definitions of hypertension, and these thresholds may vary. So if someone is documented in the chart that someone is hypertensive, again, we go back to what is that clinical context in which these measurements were taken, but also just appreciating that these definitions can vary. And so how do we actually verify this and validate these blood pressure readings and these interpretations? So you can see that this complexity is very, very deep. And so I think the entire group that was involved really came to a realization that tracking provenance for blood pressure we took this question as one of our first brainstorms because we thought we were going to be able to connect these dots very easily. What we actually discovered was that this is an incredible learning experience for all of us. And we started to appreciate the depth of the provenance of blood pressure through this exercise. So in summary, the modified brainstorm, brainswarm activity that we took was taken to accommodate the work from home environment, but I think it was also helpful in this large multidisciplinary group. We did use an online platform, and again, I'm very interested in if anyone knows of it, better tools for us to use other than using PowerPoint and connecting the dots. We did have a moderator that oriented the group and oriented the group around our what we called a swarm board and our goal statement. And we did bring the multidisciplinary team from across a large organization. And so from this, we actually helped build an inventory around provenance. How do we actually capture it? What are the tools? What are the platforms that are being used? What are the nuanced processes that are being mapped currently? It also helped us increase our awareness of the nuances of these activities in the clinical setting from a data perspective, from the technical perspective. And it helped us build these new multidisciplinary teams that had these shared goals while providing a structured approach to collectively come up with solutions and generate additional activities as well as learning. So I will end there.
Thank you so much for Dr. Chung. I don't think we have time for questions because things are going pretty late, but if anybody does have questions, I will get them to Caroline and she will do her best to maybe answer them in the chat.